And thank you for joining us for the 67th webinar in the Offshore Wind series, Learning from the Experts. I am Kate McClellan-Press, Senior Project Manager with NYSERDA's Environmental Research Team, and it's my pleasure to be joined by today's expert, Sarah Fortuna. Before I introduce our speaker, a few reminders for participants and some background on this webinar series. Next slide, please. First, if you are experiencing any technical issues, please contact John at the email address on the bottom of this slide. This webinar is being recorded, and the recordings and presentation slides for all webinars in the Learning from the Expert series are available on NYSERDA's website at the address on this slide. All participants have been muted. We will have time for Q&A following the presentation, so please use the Slido feature to submit your questions. Next slide, please. New York State is working to advance the responsible and cost-effective development of offshore wind as part of a diverse energy supply. Offshore wind is a critical component in achieving the state's energy reliability and decarbonization goals. While offshore wind has been providing clean energy to other parts of the world for several decades, this industry is brand new to New Yorkers. To provide interested stakeholders and members of the public with accessible, impartial information and opportunities for engagement on specific topics of interest, NYSERDA is hosting this educational webinar series called Learning from the Experts to connect the public with independent experts in key topics in offshore wind. We endeavor to select learning from the expert speakers based on their expertise, not necessarily for an alignment of opinions with NYSERDA or the state of New York. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter. Next slide, please. It is now my pleasure to introduce Sarah Fortuna. Sarah is a project manager with the Environmental Monitoring Division at A.I.S, Inc., with 9 years of experience supporting protected species monitoring and mitigation programs. Her expertise is grounded in both field-based and project management roles, with a focus on ensuring regulatory compliance and operational excellence across offshore industries. She leads complex monitoring programs supporting offshore renewable energy, oil and gas, and marine construction. I will now hand things over to our speaker. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you guys so much for being here today, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. A little bit more about me and my background. I am originally from West Virginia, where as a little first grader, we went on a trip to the Columbus Zoo. There, I fell in love with the manatees, and like any first grader, then hyper-fixated on manatees and learned everything that I could possibly learn about them. One of the interesting tidbits was that they were an endangered species, which I thought was interesting because they don't have any natural predators. Through additional research and kind of information gathering, I found out that humans were the main thing that impacted manatees, and from that moment decided that I was going to save the manatees and wanted to become a marine biologist. I grew up and ended up going to the University of North Carolina at Wilmington to get a marine biology degree with a minor in chemistry, and then out into the workforce, where I found A.I.S and accepted a position as a fisheries observer and a protected species observer. I have worked my way up at the company and am now, as you heard in my introduction, a project manager. But a little bit about A.I.S. We are a mission-driven company with 3 core tenets. We were founded back in 1988 to provide dredge material inspectors and protected species observers for harbor dredging and marine construction projects. Since then, we've added a variety of different capabilities and employ a diverse range of highly qualified professionals, and we ensure that we bring cutting-edge knowledge and innovative solutions to every project we support. I am a part of the Environmental Monitoring Division, and in my line of work, we deliver offshore environmental monitoring, mitigation, and logistical support to ensure regulatory and permit compliance. We support a variety of marine construction projects, including offshore wind, of course, which you're going to hear a lot about today, oil and gas operations, and just general marine construction. Think of building a bridge across a bay where there might be a population of dolphins. I am lucky to be a part of the Environmental Monitoring Division because we actually have a long-term history dealing and supporting offshore wind projects. We actually supported the very first offshore wind farm in the United States. Technically, most of it, the actual wind farm is in Rhode Island waters, but there is a small section that is in federal waters. A piece of the cable runs through federal waters. So the Block Island Wind Farm was developed in 2015, installed in 2015 and 2016, and actually transitioned that entire island-based population from diesel fuel, they like burned diesel fuel off on this island, to fully renewable energy. And generally there is an excess that gets pumped back to shore and integrated into the Rhode Island grid, which is really exciting. In addition, we also supported the very first U.S. offshore wind farm in federal waters. The Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Farm installed 2 kind of test turbines back in 2020. And you can imagine, I imagine we all remember what was going on back in 2020. So deploying teams of PSOs from 2 different countries to support a large-scale offshore wind installation was, if not anything, quite the adventure. So we have a long-standing history in the offshore wind space. We also are widely geographically dispersed. I am based out of our headquarters in North Dartmouth, Massachusetts, but we have satellite offices in key locations such as Seattle, Washington, Anchorage, Alaska, and Toms River, New Jersey. In addition to that, we have folks working out of a variety of different federal laboratories, NOAA laboratories, and home offices across the country. Basically, anywhere that you've got something going on in the US, you can almost bet we've got some folks in or around that area that can support your operations. So, before we get into specifically protected species observers, you have to understand a little bit about marine mammals and sound. So marine mammals utilize sound for a variety of purposes, many of which are listed on the slide. These are essential aspects of their lives: communication, navigation, mating, detections of predators and prey. All of these things, our protected species use sound to understand the world around them and flourish within their marine environment. We also pump a lot of sound into the environment. Shipping, noise, seismic surveys, and wind farm development, all of which are shown on the slide in these orange contours, overlap and create a lot of noise and excess sound in that marine environment. So it's important that permitted activities are regulated to protect the amount of sound that is pumped into these marine environments. Another kind of tidbit that folks I don't think always understand or are aware of is that sound travels significantly faster and farther in water when compared to air. 3 to 4 times faster is generally the understood that rate. So very interesting, very important to understand when we get to protected species observers and what they do, that marine mammals are highly dependent on being able to hear and communicate in that marine environment. Sound pollution has really 4 kind of categorical impacts on our protected species. There's physical, perceptual, behavioral, and indirect impacts. Really kind of like the crux of this is that the impact can vary in these different categories and really depends on the intensity and frequency of the sound and that exposure length. For example, the closer you are to a louder sound for a longer period of time, the more impactful it is. And the inverse is also true. Now, we get to the crux of what we're here to talk about, our protected species observers. What is that? So these are independent third-party scientific observers employed by environmental consulting firms or third-party observer providers, contracted ultimately by a project developer. A PSO will maintain a dedicated watch. They'll be visually scanning the surface during daylight hours, nighttime, and inclement weather, using some really fun technology that we're going to talk about a little bit later on to ensure that they're able to visualize or acoustically detect any protected species that are out there to be visualized or heard. So we say protected species observer. I think you probably, when you hear that word, a lot of people imagine our charismatic megafauna, our large whales and dolphins and seals, but that also includes sea turtles, fish, and other protected species such as sharks and even the queen conch down in the Florida areas. So these are our protected species observers are watching. So the photos that you see on the screen are all different PSOs on different projects that we've had watching, doing kind of like the crux of what they do. They're also maintaining an awareness of vessel activities, maintaining that awareness of operations and their surroundings to ensure safety and an understanding of whether or not they will need to enact mitigation. These folks also know and understand the permit requirements and expectations and can quickly assess situations, distances, species identification to enact mitigation to ensure that they are making accurate decisions and calling for those mitigations if they need to. Ultimately, the goal here is to reduce or eliminate the potential for injury of any of these protected species from a sound source. So not anybody can be a PSO. To be qualified to be a PSO, you must have a bachelor's degree with a major in one of the natural sciences. There is alternate experience that's assessed by the regulator who ultimately approves PSOs on a case-by-case basis. One example of that is secondary education or some other experience that could be comparable to protected species observer duties, or traditional knowledge that comes from being a part of one of our tribes. In addition to the bachelor's degree and that kind of baseline education, a specific PSO training certificate is required. In addition, safety training and fit for sea duty medical clearance. Every offshore operation, specifically in relation to offshore wind, can be far away from any medical treatment or emergency services. So it's the responsibility of every person on that vessel to understand their duty in an emergency and be able to assist as needed. A PSO training, of which A.I.S is actually a training provider. I am the main trainer these days, but PSO training goes into a lot of the stuff that we're going to touch on today throughout this presentation, the background kind of laws and regulations, but the crux of PSO training is how to identify protected species and their behaviors, and what exactly do you do on a day-to-day basis? How do you observe? What data are you collecting? How are you documenting that? And an understanding of monitoring and mitigation procedures. So PSOs are required in a variety of circumstances, but generally speaking, when permitted activities, so when one of these branches of government allows an activity that could have a potential impact on a protected species. Generally, requirements are found in an incidental take statement of an Endangered Species Act biological opinion, or in a National Marine Fisheries Service Marine Mammal Protection Act permit condition. These can be communicated to the public in the form of a letter of authorization or an incidental harassment authorization. The real difference between these is duration. So a letter of authorization is 5 years and generally covers very impactful or potentially significantly impactful sound sources, and an IHA generally is minimally impactful or scheduled for like 1 year duration. For example, geophysical surveys, minimally impactful, generally they get IHAs. Those IHAs can be extended if additional work needs to be done, and they just there's a renewal process. For offshore wind, pile driving installation, generally because they are significantly impactful, even if it is only planned for 1 year, those are granted letters of authorization. So PSOs are not only required for offshore wind related operations. PSOs support an array of marine activities. The offshore wind related options we're going to talk a little bit more about, but PSOs can support geophysical surveys, seismic surveys, which I like to kind of think of geophysical surveys using sound to create a map of the seafloor and the subsea surface, as you can see in the illustration here. Seismic, they're kind of the little brother of seismic surveys. So geophysical is like more minimal sound sources. Seismic surveys are very large scale, large operations, generally used for oil and gas prospecting down in the Gulf. In addition, you can have PSOs deployed on pile driving projects, monitoring operations. This is actually a photo from the Block Island Wind Farm install of those jacket foundations. There are many, many other operations that PSOs can cover, including dredging operations, including material placement for that dredged material, cable lay and burial, blasting operations, as you can imagine, rig deconstruction, jetty restoration, and high-speed racing operations down in, generally speaking, down in the Florida areas. Specifically for offshore wind, we're going to see PSOs deployed on geophysical surveys and pile driving. So there's multiple phases of offshore wind development, and I think there have been a couple of NYSERDA webinars that have really covered that well. So we're not going to belabor the different pieces of offshore wind development, but only to say that PSOs are involved in the site assessment via geophysical survey operations and construction, which is traditionally pile driving. You can also have some geophysical surveys done during that construction phase and also during operations and maintenance, but they're not necessarily as large scale as you see the geophysical surveys during that site assessment phase. Now, this is a really important point. I want to make sure listen and learn all of the things that I'm saying, but if you remember only one thing from this presentation, I'm hoping that it is this. The term take is often significantly misunderstood. People immediately associate the term, when they hear the term take, they associate it with killing. It does not always mean killing. It can include killing, but also includes all of these other pieces. It can mean to hunt, to harass, to capture, to collect, or attempt to do any of those things. So when the National Marine Fisheries Service authorizes an incidental take via an letter of authorization or an incidental harassment authorization, they are not giving any company or entity or survey provider or pile driving entity permission to kill animals. NOAA Fisheries, upon request, authorizes the incidental but non-intentional taking of species. Harassment, which is a kind of sub-piece of what the definition of a take is pursuit, torment, or annoyance, which includes the potential to injure a marine mammal or disturb their activities or behavioral patterns. So really, at the end of the day, noise can lead to incidental takes, but it does not mean, take does not mean that these animals are being killed. So level A, harassment, is the potential to injure. That's kind of the most intense type form of harassment that you're going to see. Level B, harassment, is really just disruption to marine mammals or protected species and their behavioral patterns, etc. So what exactly, how does this relate to PSOs? How does this relate to offshore wind? Well, let's look at an example. This is the actual take allocation section of the letter of authorization for Empire Wind. There are a couple times I'm going to reference very specific lease areas in this presentation. All of this information is publicly available online. So if you are curious, you can always Google Empire Wind letter of authorization. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the things for Sunrise. I tried to tailor this presentation to New York relevant lease areas, but this is publicly available information. So as you can see on this slide, you have the maximum annual take listed here, have our level A harassment and our level B harassment, and you have our 5-year total takes. So this letter of authorization was valid for 5 years. So we're going to compare our North Atlantic right whale, which is a critically endangered protected species, to our minke whales here, which are population doing well, not an endangered species currently. So our North Atlantic right whale has been granted 0 level A harassments by the federal government because of that species stock. How there are 500 or less left in the wild these days. So because that is would be significantly impacted by injury, that protected species stock, the federal government has not allocated any injury. They have only allocated 13 on an annual level for that level, at that level B harassment. And if you'll remember, that is really just harassment or disruption to their activities. In comparison, we have our minke whale, which has allocated 4. Again, this is not carte blanche. This is not permission to kill. This is permission to incidentally, possibly injure, with an 83 level B takes there. So that's just kind of the difference. Okay, now, how does a protected species observer relate to all of this. So they are there to ensure that when the sound sources are activated and an animal comes into one of those harassment zones or surfaces in one of the harassment zones, they are there to stop the sound. So a PSO, like we said before, is really doing a lot of watching. They're scanning the sea surface, and if there are no protected species, they're recording environmental data on a half-hour, hourly basis, depending on the permit and client requirements, and also recording operational data so they know, is pile driving active? If I have a sighting, do I need to shut things down? So they're recording operational data as it changes. In the Northeast, related to offshore wind, generally we see PSO schedules minimized to 4 hours on watch with a 2-hour break, required break after a 4-hour period, with a 12-hour maximum hours of watch per day. These watch restrictions are set forth in the permitting documentation to prevent observer fatigue, to ensure that as they are watching, which, to be honest, sometimes it's kind of a boring job. You're standing there, you're watching, you're looking at things, and nothing is happening. And you have to have kind of mental tricks to ensure that you are staying at your best. So these watch restrictions kind of help our observers stay on top of things. This is an example of an observer schedule from the Sunrise Wind Jacket Foundation pile driving plan, again, publicly available. In this example, because of the pile driving, it's a possibly significantly impactful operation. We have a lead PSO as well as 2 additional PSOs and a passive acoustic monitor. Don't worry if you don't know what that is. We're going to talk about it a little later on. It's another piece of the monitoring and mitigation puzzle. So as you can see here, you have 4 hours on watch, this lead PSO, with a minimum of a 2-hour break. There is no maximum break, of course, but you can see there's some schedule variance, and you have at least a 2-hour break on each of these, for each of these people. 3 people on watch and 1 passive acoustic monitor for every watch period. Okay, where might a protected species observer be? As you can see here, there's a variety of vantage points that you might take advantage of on a vessel that you might be working on. Some might be just above sea level, while others can put you far above. There we go. It's worth noting that you might not be able to take advantage of the highest vantage point on that vessel because it also, that asterisk there, stands for safest. You must be in a safe location when you're monitoring. Here are some other examples of what vessels that our teams have worked on. For the red vessel is a much smaller vessel. It's an inshore geophysical survey could be deployed on that vessel. And then the other vessel, the green vessel, is they can be medium to large size offshore supply vessels used for geophysical surveys, other types of works, as well as protected species observer monitoring vessels. When it comes to large scale offshore wind, I'm going to show you an example installation. I'm going to show you an example of what that looks like in a little bit. In addition to kind of like small, medium to large, you also have enormous vessels that PSOs might be monitoring from. This is actually the Harima Theloff, which was utilized for the Empire Wind offshore wind monopile installation last year. So this is the size of a cruise ship. This is a very, very large vessel to install those very large monopiles, and there was a PSO team stationed on this vessel. As you can imagine, there are some line of sight restrictions based on just the size of this vessel, which is why when it comes to offshore wind installation, generally, always, in my experience thus far in the United States, there are additional vessels required to monitor from farther out. So there's a team of PSOs on the installation vessel and additional teams on additional monitoring vessels. PSOs, in addition to watching, they are also collecting data. They are doing hourly data collection on environmental conditions, including wind, sea state, Beaufort state, glare, precipitation, kind of all of those things that can paint a picture around a protected species detection. In addition, as I mentioned before, they are recording vessel equipment use, and as things change, they can update that. It can get actually rather complicated. On a pile driving project, it's a little easier. It's like start and stop. For geophysical surveys, it can get quite complex as there are many different pieces of gear operating at different frequencies with different exclusion zones that are turned on and off at different times. So really the data collection can vary depending on the operation that you're working on. If there's a protected species detection, of course, you're also recording that information. This is actually the photo on the left is actually one of my favorite photos from this entire presentation because it is a PSO working on the Block Island wind farm install and some sperm whales you can kind of see off in the distance right up here. So if you're a PSO and you have a detection, you're collecting time, you're collecting GPS location, direction of vessel travel, direction of animal travel, the pace of that animal, any behavioral changes or what their initial behavioral status is, distance from operation, the number of individuals, collecting different pieces of information throughout multiple surfacing events to try to understand what species that is. There is a ton of information when it comes to an actual protected species detection. Outside of the data collection, here we're going to do a little bit of a vocabulary lesson. So when we walk through the kind of phases of a PSO day, you will have a better understanding. So in our regulatory documentation, there are a variety of zones that are dictated. These are defined by our regulators in that regulatory paperwork and can vary by species and sound source and even season as well. Our clearance zone is, as you might imagine, an area that must be clear protected species prior to any sound being pumped out, like regulated sounds. Our minimum visibility zone is a relatively new piece, which I actually really love. Thank you so much, regulator. So this minimum visibility zone is the area that must be consistently visible throughout operations to ensure the fact that PSO monitoring is effective. For example, if you clear the zone, you've cleared it, you could see the whole zone, then fog rolls in, your monitoring is not as effective if you don't have alternative monitoring technology that can cut through that fog. So that minimum visibility zone is really important. We also have a shutdown zone, which during active sound production must remain clear protected species for sound production to continue. Here's a couple of examples of what that kind of looks like. This is from our Sunrise Wind Letter of Authorization. We have our minimum visibility zone. These are all in kilometers for all of our marine mammals. There's a little bit of a difference between summer and winter. We're not going to get into the specificity, but you can definitely Google that. It's interesting. In the Northeast, it's a lot related to right whales. So we have our 2.7 minimum visibility zone, 2.7 kilometers. And we have our visual and acoustic clearance zones, as well as our shutdown zones. Now, one other thing that has been updated in the regulations, in the regulatory paperwork since I started in this industry, is that these zones now are consistent. So there was a time when our clearance zones and our shutdown zones were different, and it's been really wonderful recent update that these zones are consistent now. So for our North Atlantic right whale, again, calling back to the critically endangered species, any distance that our foundation installation PSOs see a right whale, they cannot start. Those in that situation, things are paused until the right whale is no longer visible by the installation PSOs. For our other large whales, it's only 4 kilometers. And again, that's consistent. Our clearance zone is consistent with our shutdown zones as well. This is just to show you an example. This is from our Empire Wind Letter of Authorization, but for HRG surveys, geophysical surveys, which are more minimally impactful, for our North Atlantic right whale, the clearance and shutdown zone is only 500 meters, with our all other non-ESA listed marine mammals being at 100 meters. That just shows you the difference in impact. The sound that's being utilized during these operations is understood to be less impactful and also less loud. Some other mitigations that you're going to come across are a pre-watch clearance and a post-watch clearance. Pre-watch clearance, as you might imagine, is ensuring that that clearance specified amount of time to ensure that that clearance zone is clear prior to the initiation of sound production. Generally, after your pre-watch clearance for any of these operations, you're going to have a ramp up or a soft start, which is really just using sound to protect animals from elevated levels of sound exposure. It's a gradual increase of sound into that environment after the clearance period. Really, the goal is to kind of trigger animals that maybe haven't surfaced yet to come to the surface or exit the area prior to full-scale sound starts. We also have a post-watch clearance. There is no shutdown or anything. This is after the sound production activity has finished, really just to quantify any other individuals that might have been in or around the area and potentially impacted. This is from our Sunrise Wind pile driving plan, that Jacket Foundation pile driving plan. This just shows us the green circle very in the middle is where that pile driving vessel and our installation vessel PSO team is located. The green and pink shapes on the slide are the PSO monitoring vessels, again with an additional PSO team located on those vessels. Our red line is that minimum visibility zone, and the red dotted line is a shutdown zone. So all the three teams of PSOs are working in tandem to ensure that this area is clear of protected species, to allow for offshore wind turbine monopile installation, the base of those turbine installation to happen in this location. So let's talk through a little bit of an example. This is a pre-start. This is before sound has started up. Let's say our PSOs and our survey team has just started their day. They have a 1 hour pre-clearance period in this example. The survey team's getting things sorted on their end, doing final checks on things, whatever the survey team might be doing, and they anticipate that it'll be about an hour and a half until they need to start, or they'll be ready to start operations, sound production operations. So they let the PSO team know that, and the PSO team says, okay, awesome, we are going to clear the zone now to ensure that they are not holding up operations. The PSO team is not like a separate entity. Yes, they're independent and third party, but everyone on these vessels works together. So the PSO team is going to work together to ensure that they're ready and the zone is clear if there's no protected species when the survey team is ready to start operations. So we start our pre-start clearance. This is our vessel, and we have our exclusion zones here, our pre-start, our clearance zones. Some time goes by, we have a sighting. Oh my goodness. I don't know if you caught it, but that was a North Atlantic right whale. So our pre-start clearance timer restarts at that point as there was a visualized animal in the zone. 1 additional hour needs to pass with no sightings in those clearance zones. Then our sound production may begin at that point. Now, after sound production might be ongoing for a little while, let's say in this example, they have that 1 hour pre-start clearance, but they just have a 30-minute shutdown requirement. That's not unheard of. So let's say our sound operations are ongoing, our exclusion or our shutdown zones are void of protected species. Some time goes by, there's a sighting. Oh my gosh. The sound production must be stopped at this point. So at this point, the PSO team is going to request a shutdown. The operations team are actually the people who implement or do not implement that call. A PSO team then records what happens. We are not the whale police. We are out there to advise folks on what their permit requirements are, how to stay in compliance with these permits. We are writing down what happens on the boat. If it doesn't happen, that is up to the survey folks. But let's say in this example, and in most examples, real life examples, the survey team says, awesome, got it, we're shutting down at this time. And they'll communicate back to PSOs and say, at this time, the sound source was turned off. PSOs will then wait and continue to monitor and allow 30 minutes to go by. Let's say in this example that those shutdown and exclusion zones remain clear, then our sound production may begin again. So that's kind of how it works in real life when it comes to our protected species observers. Let's talk about a little bit about PSOs and the technology that they utilize. So the number one piece of technology is maybe a little out of pocket. You might not assume this, but it's your eyes. Our eyes were developed over millennia to pick out motion, right? You're always going to be, that's why our phones are so addictive, but you're always going to be looking at the things that is moving. On the water, it can be a bit of an adventure with all that wave action, but your eyes are specifically designed to detect motion and help out our PSOs significantly. A PSO will use binoculars to focus on possible sightings, reticle binoculars, during our daylight hours to estimate distance. So with the reticle, that little circle that you see on the slide is kind of what the inside of binocular will look like. You put that top line on the horizon and count down, and you get a distance estimate based on the horizon, the curvature of the earth, and the height of the observer off the water, so including the vessel height. So during daylight hours, you're estimating distance either visually or with your reticle binoculars. And then at nighttime is when things get really exciting. So nighttime, dawn, dusk, and some inclement weather, you're using some of this more, PSOs generally are using some of this more high-tech gear to extend that operational window. This can include night vision, thermal imaging, and passive acoustic monitoring. So night vision is used in total darkness to detect the presence of our marine protected species. It will amplify that available ambient light and recreates an image like you can see on the slide of what is out there. Generally, they're reliable 300 to 400 meters and really should only be utilized in full darkness. But what happens if you have inclement weather during the day or the vessel for some reason has a bunch of lights? You might utilize a thermal imaging binocular. Again, utilized in darkness and some weather conditions. This device actually senses thermal or heat radiation and produces high contrast images, as you can see on the slide, of that thermal radiation. So there are handheld thermal imaging binoculars, as well as vessel-mounted thermal imaging cameras. The same concept is true. They used in darkness to detect and confirm thermal radiation of protected species. It's becoming more of a regular occurrence and really is utilized to extend some of those operational windows and ensure effective monitoring during inclement weather. Sometimes these also have automated distance detection in them, but traditionally that is only feasible when the horizon is visible. So during inclement weather during the day, it is less, so that automated distance detection is less effective at nighttime. So visual monitoring isn't the only way to observe an area for marine mammals. Some of our marine mammals can hold their breath for 90 minutes. So you have to have another kind of piece of the pie. This is another one of the tools that our PSO team can utilize, or our monitoring mitigation team can utilize to ensure that if there's animals out there, we know it. So you won't always see surface activity associated with an animal's presence, but they might be vocalizing under the surface of the water. So additionally, even if it's not during daylight, during nighttime or inclement weather, after the sun sets, it can be hard to locate animals visually. So projects will require passive acoustic monitoring as kind of a backup. It's really a form of sound monitoring technology that involves generally several hydrophones deployed into the water column to detect acoustic data and understand if there are biological sounds being made out in the water. So a passive acoustic monitor will sit generally in some kind of boat dungeon, not really a boat dungeon, but like down under the down in the inside the vessel and monitor these screens. The far left screen is actually what you're looking at and shows the different sound that you might see associated with biological animals. I'm not a passive acoustic monitoring expert. There is an additional training that these professionals go through to ensure that they know exactly what they're hearing is biologic or non-biologic. It's a highly specialized skill set, passive acoustic monitoring. Okay, communication. So PSOs are out there, they're monitoring, they're on watch, they're communicating with the folks on the vessel, of course, the vessel captain, the bridge officer, specifically if there are protected species sightings, operational changes, any vessel strike avoidance maneuvering that needs to be enacted to ensure protected species are not only not impacted by sound, but also not actively impacted by vessels that are out there working on offshore wind operations. They might be, PSOs would communicate with construction or survey folks, equipment operators, to notify them and request shutdowns or other mitigation measures. They'll be communicating with the PSOs or other passive acoustic monitoring team to coordinate observations and maintain complete coverage of the monitoring zones and ensure mitigation is enacted appropriately. They'll be communicating with their environmental coordinators or their project managers via the daily report. It is always our goal to touch base with our PSO teams, our mitigation teams, at least once a day to ensure everything is going well. And also, there is a level of communication, generally through the reporting, with regulatory representatives. We're going to talk about it in a minute, but daily, weekly, monthly, and even yearly and ultimate final reports that go to those regulators. Now, PSOs are not generally communicating sightings on the water to the public. One of the many reasons that is because it could have a siren song effect and cause boaters or other vessels in the area to come and observe whales, which puts operations, PSOs, whales, and the other boaters in an elevated risk. As with everything, there are some exceptions. I've talked a lot about right whales today because they are critically endangered. So any sighting of a right whale is significant. PSOs do communicate directly with the regulator at times when they see North Atlantic right whales. Specifically so, dynamic management areas can be triggered. So these are temporary protective zones that are triggered by a visual observation of 3 or more right whales. They are really there to alert boaters and other vessels in the area to minimize their speed, their transiting speeds through these areas, and really be on high alert for our protected species. If any of you ever want to if you ever see a right whale, if you're ever out on a vessel, there is an app it's called Whale Alert. She got it. The Whale Alert app will actually allow citizen scientists and folks offshore to report to the federal government, hey, there's right whales here. Then the federal government, the NOAA aerial teams will go out, confirm the presence of those animals, and then trigger a dynamic management area. Similarly, we can also, via PSO acoustic team or passive acoustic monitoring acoustic teams, if they hear right whales in an area, they will report that, and then that will trigger a slow zone activation. It's exactly the same, 3 or more right whales, temporary protective zone. It's just triggered in a different way. In addition to our highly sensitive species, PSOs are always reporting dead, injured, or entangled protected species. Generally, there is a communication link directly between our PSO teams on the vessel and the regulator, in this case, National Marine Fisheries Service or the Coast Guard via Channel 16, to ensure that information is communicated swiftly and that response chain can be triggered as quickly as possible. In addition to, specifically in cases of offshore wind, in addition to dead, injured, or entangled protected species, those marine mammals, etc., dead or injured birds and bats are also required to be reported per the permit stipulations, and that also falls on the shoulders of the protected species observer team. Okay, reporting. So I alluded to it a little bit before, but PSOs are doing a lot of watching and doing a lot of data collection. That data is then compiled into a variety of different reports. So our protected species observers will enter data in. Our lead PSO will generally do some additional level of QA/QC, and then will submit a daily report to an observer provider. As the project manager, I then go in and QA/QC, ask any questions, ask for clarification, ask for maybe a little bit of additional information if there were maybe holes, because I'm not out there on the vessel. I want to make sure that the story that's told in the data is very clear. The data will then maybe go through a round of QA/QC and then be sent off to the project operator, who then submits as required to the regulatory agency. There is a public export kind of ultimate submission through the monitoring reports and agency publications that are publicly available. If you're curious to read them, I would Google PSO report or National Marine Fisheries Service PSO report, and you can generally find about a handful of easily publicly available reports. You might see our name out there. So that's the daily vessel report. Generally, it includes operations, monitoring effort, detections, mitigation actions, and potential exposures, right? Any potential takes. One other note, I think they hear this word potential take, and I think folks have asked us a lot to quantify a take, but that is not something that an observer provider does. That's not something that a developer or an operator does. The only entity that can say this was or was not a protected species take is the regulator. Generally, the way that we talk about it, we will say this is a potential take, or this interaction meets the criteria of a take. We are not the ultimate deciders. We are providing the information, and the regulator is ultimately making that decision. It's a really important distinction that I want to get out there publicly in this format. So we have our daily reports, then we get upgraded to weekly reports in the offshore wind realm. It's really just a grouping of all of the daily reports and kind of daily information, and a weekly snapshot that goes to those developers and the federal agencies. Monthly reports and final reports are literally the same thing, just additional information over a longer period of time. In the final report, there's also generally a statement on the efficacy from the PSO perspective, or from our perspective on monitoring and mitigation for the project. If there was any difficulties or possible improvements, generally speaking, that's included in the final report. While this framework provides multiple layers of oversight, I think there could be greater transparency achieved through standardizing the reporting formats and creating like a central database that people can pull information from, while maintaining the important kind of like proprietary information outside of that. I think there is a way to there should be a way. We can find a way if we all put our heads together of creating some kind of centralized database that people that need the information can pull the information from. Along those same lines, there's accountability and transparency within the protected species observer realm. Accountability comes through a variety of mechanisms. Initially, qualification review that occurs via the regulator, so NOAA Fisheries, National Marine Fisheries Service, evaluates PSO education, training, and experience before they ultimately approve individuals for regulated activities. Approvals can be conditional or unconditional and can lapse after a certain period of inactivity. It's really important that people that go out on these projects have the appropriate experience to be able to effectively monitor and mitigate for these species. Permit compliance is another form of accountability. So the operator or leaseholder, they are technically legally responsible for maintaining compliance with their permits, and they are responsible for any companies that they hire to ensure that those folks are also in compliance. So those PSO reports document whether required monitoring and mitigation measures are implemented and any opportunities for improvement, as I mentioned before. Quality control comes through myself and the other PSO observer providers that conduct QA/QC, review field reports, do any like additional back and forth with the PSO teams offshore to ensure that data is clear and consistent. And we also maintain training records and ensure that folks we are deploying offshore have the appropriate qualifications, including safety, the safety pieces of that. And we circle all the way back around to the regulator, who does provide ultimate oversight that when they review the submitted reports, inspect project records, and investigate any non-compliance or non-conformity instances. Transparency does vary depending on the type of project, but generally the monitoring reports, as we mentioned before, weekly, monthly, seasonal, annual, and final, like over the course of a letter of authorization, there might be 3 or 4 different final annual reports, and then one ultimate final report that pulls together all of the data that was collected, all of the information associated with this authorized activity, and provides an update on like final impact. Again, these reports are frequently posted, so you can always Google that. In addition, the data that PSOs collect can be incorporated, and often are incorporated into environmental assessments, biological opinions, permitting documentation, and are available during additional regulatory reviews. So as you might imagine, there are like, what's the next phase, right? We talked about some really fun technology and kind of like where the PSO industry sort of stands now. Unsurprisingly, AI has touched the PSO industry as well. It is currently being developed and utilized as a decision support tool. It will help detect, classify, and kind of prioritize potential sightings and acoustic detections, but is generally used only to augment the human expertise rather than replace it. I don't see a world where AI is like making mitigation decisions. I don't see a regulator approving that, but as it stands right now, it is a decision support tool. In addition, there are some pretty cool things happening with our infrared or thermal imaging technologies, such as our cooled cameras. So these type of systems will offer greater sensitivity, longer detection ranges, and really high image quality. It could potentially help expand some of these operational windows and improve efficacy during times of inclement weather, which we have a ton of up in the New England and kind of like Northeast area. Bottom-mounted PAM systems are also an additional kind of piece that we do see utilized. This is actually from one of the foundation's installation projects, the Sunrise Wind. Each of the red flags here is a bottom-mounted passive acoustic monitoring system, and these also all of these orange circles are that range of detectability. So the bottom-mounted systems provide a really wide range of acoustic coverage to meet that, as you might have seen on one of the previous slides, that 10-kilometer minimum acoustic detection distance. Also, another thing, remote work has also touched the PSO world, but that really depends on some of these other technologies, how good our camera systems are, how good the connectivity has improved over the last years significantly. But to be able to do sort of hybrid teams where there are some PSOs deployed out on a vessel and passive acoustic monitors out on a vessel to ensure, God forbid, if connectivity is impacted, they will be able to effectively mitigate and monitor. So we could potentially see hybrid type teams with some PSOs deployed and some PSOs working remotely. My sort of one final touch point is just to give you a good example, like PSOs are highly trained, skilled, experienced observers. Each one of these photos has an indicative characteristic that if a PSO saw it, they would immediately be able to tell you like what this animal is. These are not people that are just out there having a good old time. Like, they are professional observers that have sometimes put decades of experience behind the decisions that they make in their careers. So they really are, they're great. PSOs are great. The ultimate goal of protected species observing is to reduce or eliminate potential for injury of any of these protected species from any kind of permitted sound source, and really to document any interactions. We're not the whale police. We want to make sure that we can do offshore enterprise exploration, but that our protected marine resources are protected during that exploration. Okay. Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you so much, Sarah. And it was great that you ended on advanced technology, because we did get several questions on that, and I think you covered it really well. So I'll jump into some of the other questions. If you have an additional question, be sure to use the Slido feature at the bottom of the webinar. I want to start with, you talked a lot about the complexity of PSO's work offshore, how many different responsibilities they are juggling, and you also mentioned standardizing reporting, centralizing data as potential improvements. We had a question about other ways in which there are challenges on PSOs working offshore, and how regulators already support or could be more supportive of PSOs work.
Yeah, I think a direct line from a PSO to the regulator, we have these like whistleblower lines across the board. Generally speaking, and I have had really great experiences with almost every client that we've worked with. I'm very grateful for that. And our management in house has always supported PSOs when they have needed it. But an independent, kind of outside the box whistleblower line might be useful for protected species observers. I do have to say, it has been really great to see some of the upgrades and updates in these regulatory documents. There's very specific language now included in the letters of authorization for some of this large scale pile driving that says it is illegal to harass, and gives kind of like the definition of harassment, or try to impede a protected species observer from doing their job, which is it's really nice to see that. I think it was implied in a lot of the initial documentation, but really is wonderful to see the regulator kind of standing up for these folks that are deployed out on these vessels. Like, there are PSOs that I have never met in person that I've worked with for years. So it's really important to, as a project manager, to develop relationships with your team and check in with them and make sure you know what's going on out on that vessel, because they're in a closed environment. It's long hours. It can be very stressful. So just ensuring that you have the opportunity to kind of get to know your team and have faith in the team that's out offshore is really essential for a team that's going to be successful.
Thank you. I think this is a good follow-up question to that. Have you, as policies change, like how do PSO providers adapt to changing federal policies? How, like, and as a trainer, you're passing that information on to a lot of people. How does that system work?
Yeah, so I obviously can't speak to every single PSO provider, but I can speak to the way that we do things and the way that we update our training. We have a direct link with the federal government that we are technically considered, our PSO training is compliant with the federal requirements. So anytime that they have updates, they change species lists, like if the endangered species list will change, they will audit our PSO training and to ensure that we have all the updated information. The most recent audit actually included the addition of the queen conch down in the Gulf of Mexico, a couple different ray species that are now identified and need to be covered. So we're always updating in that sense. In addition, we also, again, I can speak for us, we always provide a training for our PSO team, just the PSO team, prior to them getting out in the field. So we have an opportunity for us to get face to face with them to tell them, these are the mitigations. This is what we know about the project. This is what we know about the boat. This is what you can expect duration wise, operation wise, client wise, and give them a free and open space to ask us questions to ensure that they feel comfortable with what they're going to be going out and doing.
Thanks. I'm going to try to squeeze in one last question for you, and I'll make it one of the easier ones, so you'll have be able to answer it with only a minute left. Do you have any opinions on soft skills for PSOs to have or develop, as people might be interested in entering this field?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Great question. So I love this question. I think soft skills for PSOs are the same as soft skills for almost anyone. Communicate, learn how to communicate effectively, utilizing minimal words, which is an adventure that I have myself. Learning how to communicate, learning how to effectively listen. And be a good team member in a family, in a workspace, and this is kind of across the board for life. And I think one other piece is, like, don't assume malice in anybody's actions just across the board as a PSO. Sometimes you might call for a shutdown and then they don't shut down. And what happens if they don't shut down? Oh my gosh. Well, maybe they worked for 6 months prior to this on a project with exactly the same gear in a different location where they didn't have protected species and they didn't have a shutdown requirement. Have a conversation with those guys. And really try to understand where other people are coming from. Yes, we need to get this shut down. We need to get this sorted, but it's important to kind of think about other people's perspectives and assume that people are not working in malice.
I think that's great. And we have one other question that's come up, and I want to squeeze it in. You talked a lot about accountability, transparency, and objectivity for PSOs. And can you kind of expand a little bit more about that on like how much ownership they have over the process to kind of meaningfully be able to work with the people operating to, do a stop operations or any other kind of, thing that is triggered and noticed by them?
Yeah, there is always an active back and forth. We always have, so in addition to that initial PSO training that we do internally with our PSO team, there is, generally speaking, especially on the offshore wind projects and projects that end up working efficiently and effectively, there is also a training with the entire operational crew, generally the entire vessel actually, to describe like these are the species we might see, these are the mitigation measures, this is what we expect. So there is an initial level of communication, and I have always had really great relationships. Again, I can't commit cannot speak for everyone, but we've always had really great relationships with offshore wind developers. They are aggressively invested in maintaining permit compliance, specifically when it comes to endangered species and protected species, because these are not just like rinky-dink laws. These are federal legislations that have been in place for over 50 years. So it's really essential to maintain compliance such that the developers can have a positive working relationship with their regulators. So we have always, a lot of times, a PSO provider will have a direct link, and our PSO teams will have a direct link with the people that are committed to maintaining the compliance. If ever there are issues, there are accountability problems, obviously initially we'll start going to the operator and try to solve the problem at that level prior to like calling in the big guns, as it were. But there generally is a direct link between the PSO team, the PSO provider, and that developer and the permit holder.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was great information. A lot of really interesting things to think about. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this Learning from the Experts webinar. Just a reminder that the webinar is recorded and the presentation slides will be available on NYSERDA's website. Our next webinars in the series will be in September. We will be beginning a Learning from the Experts mini-series with 5 webinars focusing on the details of offshore construction. And the New York Independent System Operator will explore how new renewable generation integrates into the existing electrical grid and interacts with existing power plants. So please check back soon for registration details on win.ny.gov. We also encourage you to check out past webinars in the series on NYSERDA's YouTube channel. If you would like to request a topic or speaker for the series, please email us at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov or fill out our Learning from the Experts survey posted on our events page. Thank you for joining us today, and see you next time.